Damas y caballeros, es para mí un gusto presentarles mi amigo personal Orlando Samoes, que es profesor del distinguido Instituto de Estudios Políticos de la Universidad Católica Portuguesa. Es profesor de filosofía política con especialidad en las ideas de Adam Smith, Montesquieu y James Madison. Enseña también pensamiento político en Católica Business School. Adicionalmente, imparte el curso de teoría de juegos con especialidad en las ideas de la Escuela de Public Choice. Y, además, es profesor del reconocidísimo profesor Juan Carlos Espada, que es el mayor referente del liberalismo en Portugal. Ha sido también invitado varias veces a la reunión general de la Sociedad Montpellier. Profesor Orlando, has publicado varios trabajos, como por ejemplo el capítulo Un liberalismo en ideologías políticas contemporáneas, el único libro sobre ideologías políticas en Portugal. Su tesis, Resultados y Mérito, un estudio sobre la orden espontánea de Friedrich Hayek. Actualmente es editor jefe del periódico académico Nova Cidadania, que es el único periódico portugués académico que no es socialista. Es un placer para mí darle la palabra al profesor. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Bernardo. He's always too kind, but actually it's indeed true that Nova Cidadania is the only journal not socialist in Portugal. Yes, well, thank you. I didn't know you knew Spanish so well, but unfortunately, I think I'll speak in English, and if you don't understand, I don't know, raise your hands. I'll try to be as slow as I can. The argument, it's not, that difficult, so I think we can just proceed. Thank you very much for being here. Allow me this non-native English. I think that there's just two of us speaking in English. But I promise next time I'll be more fluent in Spanish, and then we can try. I have a very small presentation over the PowerPoint, but just with the quotations. So it's not that fancy. I won't show any graphs or anything connected with the drugs decriminalization, which is my main topic. You'll see that the argument is a bit philosophical. I hope you like it. I'm not here to convince you or to persuade you. As you'll see, some of the argument will actually border upon things you might already believe, but some other things I'll just trying to provoke you. As I'm 2 years to be teaching, that means that, we often consider arguments which we don't completely or fully believe just to test it out. So, this is something that I would submit to test. And I would start like this. In the world we live, we tend to believe that in order to achieve a certain result, we would need to rationally engage with that result or trying to use some powers or coercive powers in order to get it. We know that this is not true from Hayek, from Popper, Oakeshott, and all that. That is that sometimes there are results we can achieve without really intending to achieve them. And I think that is, broadly speaking, what I will tell you about. Sometimes coercion might not be the best means in order to achieve something. So my first part is called something like Rules Emerging from Anarchy. And I want you to do this thought experiment with me. Imagine that nothing is said beforehand. It is not obvious what happens when nothing is dictated beforehand. Imagine you want to meet with someone, with another person. Of course, if you want to meet with someone, to have an encounter, it would be much better to just arrange a place and a time suitable to both. But I'll make it more difficult, and I'll tell you, well, imagine you want to meet with someone, but you don't know who the person is. Imagine you have to meet with someone, even from this group, but you don't know who the person is. And some theories say that at the border between game theory and decision theory, that it is not impossible to match path, even if you don't know the person that you shall or not meet. For instance, some theories say that if you want to meet someone you don't know, there are actually some likelihood you'll meet the person. Some thinkers say that if two persons who do not know each other wanted to meet, they could do so. For instance, there are lists of cities, often quoted, and specific places where you would find the person. So, I mean, we tend to say the same answer, and as far as the other person is giving the same answer as we are, probably we could find a middle way. Ian McLean is not far from being a libertarian or something. He says, look at the sentence, there is an infinity of possible places and 140 possible times, like if you count at each minute is a possible time. But half of the subjects of an inquiry made by Schelling and Coleman say that half of the subjects would choose a certain station. They are asking this question in New York, and near half of them would choose noon. So you might not know anything about the person you're supposed to meet, and guess what? More than half will actually say the same thing. By that, it means that they would even, they would really meet at noon. So central train stations, sometimes midnight or sometimes at noon, are often chosen by those who know absolutely nothing about those whom we are trying to meet. The city most often quoted is New York. London and Paris are the next ones. There is a chance that two people with no contact could meet on the 1st of January of a given year. So if you ask someone, well, in which day of the year would you pick up to meet someone you don't know? Many people say 1st of January, so then guess what? They would actually meet on the 1st of January. So if we relax these hypotheses and include some time of knowledge about each other, about a person, or the reason for this meeting to take place, then the chance of matching increases. The lesson then is simple. We do not need to have an enforcing mechanism to have order. Order can be the result of spontaneous interaction. Well, we know that by Hayek, but it's always good to know that statistically it also works. So then we can also say that, these people that consider that grown apparatus of free interaction can be chaotic, licentious, wicked, or morally neutral, they might be invited to reconsider this. When we actually think about emerging rules of conduct resulting from human interaction, we can see that these chaotic, licentious, and wicked apparatus of free interaction won't really happen. Let me give you an example, which I really like. It's the example of carpool. Carpool is basically a method by which people give free rides to each other, to people who they don't know. And people who do not know each other share a car and split the costs between them. This practice is, takes place in the United States mainly, but it's starting here in Europe, probably you heard about. So we can actually argue that the situation started in some sort of anarchy. Nothing was said beforehand, and now we have a system of free lifts in the car or free rider movement in the car. And at a given time and place, some concrete place near some certain sidewalks started to be the place for each one with a car and willing to share the car in this carpool mechanism. This place started to be the place for the carpool. No one said in advance, well, let's take this sidewalk and meet here. But some sidewalks start to be more, used. It's like, the idea of the central station. There are some spots that, currently and more recurrently people just use. So, but this does not mean, actually on the contrary, that these places found through interaction are arbitrary or, again, chaotic. On the contrary, as you see, there are some, fixed places, fixed rules, fixed times that actually happen to take place without us telling a word beforehand. In fact, the carpool locations were the most convenient. Otherwise, they would not even be considered for such a purpose. So actually, it was places where the cars could actually stop and take, someone in to give a lift to some, place. The time and place determined was actually then found to be the most proper time and place, and all the other alternatives were turned down, but they were turned down not by mandatory action or by coercion of the state, they were just turned down. Now let's make these even more interesting. Because, well, you can say, well, this carpool thing is very efficient, but now let's make it more than efficient. So let's say that, and again, I'm not trying to convince you, far from that, let's say that actually these results from interaction can be good to some extent, can be morally accepted. For instance, at some point, some women started not to show up to carpool with other people. They just disappeared. And the consequences were devastating as the number of cars willing to carpool decreased and the waiting time in queue increased. And, the system was being destroyed. So in order to restore the business, some men started to think that, well, we must behave as gentlemen and probably we should allow women not allow women to stand alone in the sidewalk. So let's give them the priority in the carpool. And that was actually quite good fun because a tacit rule arose, a practical rule, which gave the women a priority in the queue. So in this process of carpool, women may never stand alone in the sidewalk. They always are preferred. By knowing beforehand that the women, would never be left alone at the sidewalk, women returned to the carpool venture. The queues diminished and efficiency thrived. It was in everybody's interest, self-interest, to sustain a laudable and moral rule of conduct, saying women have priority. Again, without an act of legislation or regulation, a general rule was found by the interaction and its efficacy, and it is easy to argue that it entails a moral dimension. This rule, which gives priority to women, is not neutral. In fact, it gives priority to people considered more vulnerable or just to the ones who didn't feel comfortable with the previous rule, which was first come, first served. The carpool practice also led the creation of another spontaneous rule. For instance, travels inside the carpool, are not supposed to talk about football, religion, or politics. Don't ask me why. It was by experience that this rule came about too. This is certainly a further constraint on liberty of the passengers, and yet it was in liberty and in free interaction that they choose to establish it. It is a voluntary and generally accepted. My argument then would go like this. To enjoy liberty is often to know where or how to curtail it, liberty, by means of general rules. These general rules were not meant to hamper liberty, but actually it allows us to enjoy it fully. Otherwise we would lose these good practices with good results. Then it is because we treasure liberty, I think, that we may accept some form of rule of law. Again, I'm not trying to convince you, but some may agree. And some may also agree that some excesses of liberty lead to licentiousness. And here let me start with a deeper note. Some people say that our ancestors in the Genesis were expelled from the Garden of Eden precisely for taking a bite out of the only apple they could not reap. To some medieval philosophers, this so-called fall of humanity represents the passage from a state of perfection to the state we are in, full of injustice, diseases like Ebola, death, and all that, war. So it seems that, according to these authors of the Bible, let's put it like that, a sneaky snake enticed Eve's appetite over proper limits, leading humanity towards damnation. Now we are all doomed. But look at this carefully. And now let's look at it with Adam Smith. It is true that, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden felt tempted to know more and to know as much as God. That's why they reaped the apple. But maybe they were conceived as such. Why did they listen to the snake first place? Therefore, we can argue that temptation lay inside our hearts before the snake came to visit us. They, Adam and Eve, were ultimately designed not to be perfect. They are imperfect, otherwise they would never listen to the devil. This is more or less some of the strain of thought that came from some of the Scottish philosophers in the 18th century. And they would speak of that as the author of nature. The author of nature is the one that conceived everything, and so on and so forth. And he said, well, and Adam Smith says that, well, he, perfect as he is, he conceived mankind in such a way that he would know exactly the power of self-love and self-interest he installed in each one of us. That is our own self-love. For the Scottish philosophers, then, this natural propensity we have to indulge in our self-love could not be simply considered wrong. The only thing virtue really required was an ability to tune down or bring down the strong impulses of self-centered actions, often arose by self-love, and to the extent that these self-centered actions can be harmful to others. Hume, Smith, and Butler, all of the same period, agree that everyone is entitled to use the best of his knowledge, this sounds like Hayek, and to strain every muscle in order to beat his or her competitors. And I often quote this. This is a quote that I don't have actually, but that you can, I think, follow. Adam Smith says, "In the race for wealth and honors and performance, he, man, may run as hard as he can and strain every muscle in order to outstrip his competitors. But if he should jostle or throw down any of them, the indulgence of the spectators is entirely at the end. It is a violation of fair play, which they cannot admit of." So it seems that self-love is, by nature, carved in our hearts, and to some extent, it's naturally to indulge it. Hutchinson and Melville, in their turn, insisted that the only pure benevolence could constitute real virtue, and that any compensation felt at the level of self-love was therefore a mark of this malicious, degree we have, something like that. On the other hand, we have Hume, Smith, Butler saying that actually, well, virtue was not to be attained by denying the impulses of self-love, but instead to moderate those impulses. For Smith, virtue was based on the degree which we tune down our passions coming within our hearts. That's not it's the next one. Yeah. And he defines virtue in a very interesting way. It doesn't look like that interested, but I'm telling that is. Virtue consists not in one affection. The candidates by the time were propriety, benevolence, and so on. He rather says, but in the proper degree of all the affections, that all should be very emphatic. So it's like virtue is not simply denying your self-interest, denying your self-love, nurturing only one specific affection. It's actually in the proper degree of all. That means that they all should be there included. It's like a basket. It's like a mash in which, all have their place as ingredients. This requires, in order for you to steer the proper degree of all affections in order to find virtue, you actually need to properly acknowledging your passions. Virtue does not reside in simply denying passions. And this is more or less what actually happens in the marketplace. And I would like to go back. Yeah. Now we have this main sentence. Everybody read this dozens of times, but now it might be clear because we are saying, something about self-love, enriching the other self-love. Adam Smith is provoking us. He's saying, well, look at this. In the marketplace, we address ourselves not to their humanity. By the way, he didn't like humanity that much. He said, well, humanity is a sort of a spectator's virtue, but sometimes it's not that good. Sometimes it's just, he called, gestures of humanity can be just weep when, or crying when someone is sick or ill. just that you're not doing much. Generosity is much more important. And you have to be very generous and benevolent in order to try to fulfill the self-love of other person. So look, there's a sort of a pleonasm there. I made it italics, their self-love. It's like it's not just to indulge their love, to care for what they care. It's care for the other person as the other person really is. What is important to the other person. That's what really matters when you trade. It's not your self-love. It's actually the other person's self-love. Look at this movement. There's nothing more, pure than this. The moment of trade, don't think about you. Think about the other person. But not what the other person likes, but what the person likes for herself. What is important for her. So that their self-love, it's almost like saying, well, put yourself in his shoes and think as he thinks. And on the other side, you'll be, also, of course, reaching or indulging your self-love because you probably will get, richer or better off. But that's even beside the point. So what does this require? How can we actually care for the self-love of the others? Adam Smith said, well, again, let's bring down our self-centered affections. Let's use self-command. Self-command for him was very important. Let's, act as if we were in the other person's shoes and enter into the vicissitudes of his heart and so on and so forth. And all of this requires lots of virtue. Virtue, again, lies in the way we properly tune and adjust our passions. Guess what? Even if we consider not virtue but vice, some of this can apply. There are, again, some intrinsic limits to how far we may indulge in one thing or the other, in one way or the other. Let me give you this example. Imagine a smoker. I'm not a smoker, so I can be neutral in this. I know some, and they always confirm this bias. They don't want to smoke 24 hours a day. They won't enjoy it. On the contrary, they often recognize that there is an increase of pleasure, or in pleasure, when they experience some time span without smoking. So, if you are prevented from smoking, then you enjoy much more. And the same goes for many things connected with these affections or things that we like to indulge with our self-love. The same goes, for instance, for sensual pleasures. Even in terms of sensual pleasures, we do not just want quantity. We want also quality. So again, sometimes even some time span without them can really increase the pleasure when you finally get it. And Francis Hutchinson, guess who? Francis Hutchinson was the professor of Adam Smith, probably you heard about it. He's considered the father of Scottish Enlightenment. And he argues something like that, well, even to the licentious, dissolute, and depraved, guess what? Someone who has less sex, it actually can be more attractive than someone who has more. And by this, he actually tried to tell us that, well, look at this, chastity can be a very good thing then, because, it increases the whole potential. Let's go to the next. So then it's not the next, but the next one. Look at that. Professor of Adam Smith in the middle of the Scottish Enlightenment, he said, now let us examine those who looser conduct with relation to the fair sex. And we shall find that love of sensible pleasures is not the chief motive of debauchery or false gallantry. Were it so, the meanest prostitutes would please as much as any. But we know sufficiently that men are fond of good nature, faith, peasantry, of temper, wit, and many other moral qualities. This is by nature we care for these moral qualities. Guess what? Even in a mistress. And this may furnish us with a reason for what appears pretty unaccountable. And I put it in bold just for you to see how interesting that is. That chastity itself has a powerful charm in the eyes of the dissolute, even when are attempting to destroy it. Even to the dissolute, to the depraved, chastity is a value. He will prefer chastity to someone who doesn't. So guess what? Again, self-restraint, restraint coming from within, is something that, we can all perceive as, well, this is actually a good thing. So we tend to prefer the one who actually exalts greater virtue. There is self-constraint, self-control, self-command. And, of course, this is something that we might not all agree, and I'm trying to convince you. I'm just quoting from Hutchinson. But the point is clear that liberty may not always or inevitably lead to an unstraight action. On the contrary, liberty may actually to induce us to curb improper behavior and to impose limits on our own action. And these limits come from within. And if these limits come from within, if we easily find that, custody or this sort of prudence, this sort of self-control is important, if and only if may be coming from within, what is the role of the state concerning these things? And now in order to actually reach what I think could be the role of the state when it comes to things like, vices or things from which we may take pleasure, let me start with a medieval thinker, and now I'm getting even more provocative, which is St. Thomas Aquinas. Guess what? According to St. Thomas Aquinas, passions, and following our passions, was not good or bad. Passions for him were simply passions, just that. It is only through mediation of reason that we would understand the morality of actions, but passions are excluded from this charge precisely because they are not mediated by reason. They are precisely affections, strong affections, that come directly in what he called our soul. Passions then, according to Thomas Aquinas again, don't ask permissions and they don't concede any sort of negotiation with reason. According to Aquinas then, you may love someone or something which you wish not to love. You wanted to choose who you fall for, but you can't. It's passion. But then, therefore, you may not say that loving something or someone is simply wrong, because in order to make it wrong, you need this intermediation and intervention of reason. Of course, I know that Ayn Rand would totally disagree with this, and some of her readers, and think that passions are also driven by reason, steered by reason. That's okay. But look at this. In one way or the other, some people would give up everything to love someone different. The only thing is that with Thomas Aquinas that won't be possible. Passions do not bargain with us. They are simply stronger than us. This is not to say that some vices, such as drugs, and I'm getting to the point, are completely involuntary. They are not. We know they are not. Though some people argue that the addicts turn out to be addicts, or they had a sort of a very high propensity to turn out to be addicts, this cannot be the whole truth. This line, which believes the addicts were addicts before addiction, needs further explanation. But, to some extent, if you follow this, we would actually argue that, the vice of falling in the vice of drugs or something would be inevitable due to genetic inborn combinations. I'm not a psychologist. I don't believe in this, but again, it's a psychological approach, which might not be right. But a lesson can be taken from this. This can contribute to an argument that says that to some extent, the person falling on a vice may lack some control over the vice itself. And that's what the Portuguese thought in the 80s. The person might need then help, not really imprisonment. And now we can change from Hutchinson to David Hume. Look at what David Hume, not that, actually the next one. Oh, good, yeah, that's the one. Not that I agree with David Hume, which I don't, but look at this. Says he, were the disposal of human life so much reserved as the peculiar province of the Almighty, that it were an encroachment on his right for men to dispose of their own lives. And then he says, it would be equally criminal to act for the preservation of life as for its destruction. What does that mean? If we believed in God, in the Almighty, then our life is not at our disposal. Our life is not ours, it's God's. But, and now here's the trick from David Hume, if we do not believe in God, we can still say that our life is our own. It's the other way around. But then, destroying it or prolonging it, so contribute to its preservation or for its destruction, has again to be a bit neutral. So why on earth would the state tell you that you cannot destroy? That would be morally the same thing as saying that you should preserve. So to allow the states to be the sort of the mighty guardian of our life is to endow the state with a coercive right, and guess what? To imprison against our will. The state could act coercively, as it does around the world, except in Portugal, and tells us that this act of violence, the coercion it applies, it's because our life is more important for the state than it is for us. Look at this. It's a bit tricky. In this case, the state does not authorize, for instance, suicide or drugs. And so it actually said, well, your life is not worth for you, it's worth for me state. So that's why you might not destroy it. The state, to some extent, is holding us as hostage. It forces us to live a life in freedom if and only if we are healthy and productive. We live only as contributors to the welfare state. Well, we all know that, indeed. I mean, we cannot be shooting heroin all day at our home because then we would be just receiving a pension or something. We're not being productive. Then, if we fall into disgrace and drugs, the state actually accelerates the pace of our own destruction. It actually, coercively imprisons you and so on and so forth. But this is not all. If we allow the state to tell us what is wrong or right, or which vices we are not allowed to indulge, where do we draw the line? If the state criminalizes vice, what kind of rewards does it bestow us in virtue? It attributes to us in virtue. How does the state then behave? If the state wants to enforce its own vision of what is good, namely to preserve our lives, it may be actually start forcing everyone to be virtuous by mandate, and they are doing that. If we actually, we are taking this path, and we will soon wake up in the world where the state will tell us how many days we should go to the gym, or then it's not just simply prolonging life or preserving life. It will be really forcing us to be virtuous citizens, like the state can force us to play the violin, to appreciate Picasso. Where do they really draw the line? Next, the state will probably forbid us to eat bacon or sugar candy. It is actually proven by some studies that more people die of overeating than from the use of drugs. So one day we'll wake up and it will be forbidden to eat, bacon or something like that. And there are already all kinds of restrictions, such as on the place we can smoke or not, some including our private houses. Can you imagine that? A note of history could be worthwhile. Only the Nazis, started with this banning and restrictions upon smoking. But that was because they wanted to reach the perfect man, the last man, the overman. And they didn't really authorize each one to be as he is. Guess what? We are all imperfect, and this gives our humanity. We might not want to be perfect. We might want to live life in liberty and to be free to enjoy our own perfect activities. Michael Oakeshott explains this very well. Sometimes, libertarians don't read Michael Oakeshott. I know he's a sort of a conservative, but he's quite right in this. He says that in the center of a free society, we find a disposition to do what we want, activities which define our personal identity. For what do we want liberty? Think about it. According to Oakeshott, we want liberty to enjoy our own way of living. That is, he gives some examples: to go fishing, to entertain friends. Speaking of entertaining friends, and I'm already told that I have just some minutes, but speaking of which, I would like to make you a comparison between several kinds of drugs, because some drugs are actually legal, others are not. That would make us go very far. But it was always, acceptable for people to drink alcoholic drinks, except in the case of Prohibition. Some people say that it's actually because if you actually drink more than you should, you'll feel sick. At some point of the night, you'll always hear someone saying, I mean, if you're all getting drunk, you will always hear someone saying, I will never drink again. That's when the person's getting very sick. So alcohol has a sort of a limit, and pleasure turns to nausea at some point, and that's the point you shall stop, please. Otherwise, you'll be like, throwing up next day. But it is indeed, on the same regard, a great mistake to restrain distribution of alcohol through legal action. We had this, prohibition, dry law, things like that. At least in Portugal, there was never such a thing. Actually, on the contrary, the more countries restricted, Salazar said, well, over 1 million people worked in the wine industry, so we don't really care. What he said? Well, he was a, terrible dictator, but he was right on that, I think. And guess what? The more you actually forbid alcohol, it's like the forbidden fruit of Adam and Eve again, the worst. And guess who said that too? Adam Smith. And that's amazing. He talks about the Spaniards and everything. Now, the next quotation is really interesting. Like I was telling you, instead of showing graphs and stuff, we can hear from the master. Adam Smith says, it deserves to be remarked that if we consult experience, the cheapness of wine seems not to be a cause, not of drunkenness, but of sobriety. Wow. The inhabitants of the wine countries are in general the soberest people in Europe. Witness the Spaniards. Hello. The Italians, some of them there. And the inhabitants of the southern provinces of France. People are seldom guilty of excesses in what is their daily fare. Nobody affects the character of liberality and good fellowship by being profuse of a liquor which is as cheap as a small beer. On the contrary, and now the most important part, in the countries which, either from excessive heat or cold, produce no grapes, and where wine consequently is dear and a rarity, drunkenness is a common vice. So again, make it accessible to all, and then you'll see that no one will care. Actually, when something is dear and a rarity, it will also be more expensive. And now I would like to follow with Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman explains so well the effects of the government criminalizing drugs and drug-related actions. He says that actually, by making it illegal for participants to join the market, the small dealers, government is unintentionally providing the cartels, the big dealers of drugs, to actually reap a monopoly profit. There is to supply the product only at a very high price and secure an economic rent provided through legislation. So who is benefiting out of this? The big dealers. But the arrests, when the police catches, people, they are usually the so-called the little fish in English, or small servants, people who are just trading 1 gram or something. And those are not even the violent ones. Then you have a society in which basically you're catching the wrong people, catching those who are just, trading very small amounts. They are the poor. They are trying to actually make the price go down with these good effects. And besides, I'm not even arguing that this is a voluntary action between consenting adults, but the thing is that drug prohibition is not much wiser than alcohol prohibition. It's more or less the same thing. It's like protecting drug cartels, and the prices are set too high, and no one can really, compete with them. They won't be caught because, they won't risk their lives. They'll actually force, through violent means, people to trade below them for them to be caught. And so basically what we have is a very interesting situation that, for me to summarize, I'll tell you like this. As it happens with all economic regulation, trying to steer the economic activity from top down generates unintended consequences. The intended results are never achieved. So the war on drugs propagates drugs, imprisons victims, and grants monopolies and richness to the real criminals. All of this is done with public taxpayers' money. So we're actually paying to imprison those who are, the victims, and we are just providing a rent to the leaders, to the drug cartels, and everybody is fine with this. Oh, when I say here that actually propagates the drugs, I had here a further argument saying that these prices high are the ones who actually multiply the number of drugs you have available, such as crack, which is like an invention composed of cocaine in order to lower the price. Just in 3 minutes, let us go then to the case of Portugal. Portugal was, a doomed country in the 80s. I lived in the 80s. I remember being like 3 or 4 years old, and it was terrible. I remember thinking that, thinking of youth, the word youth was for me some bunch of guys, dressed in black who were actually drug addicts and things like that. There were syringes on the floor everywhere. Portugal was a country rich enough to afford it and poor enough and stupid enough to actually take them. So I think it's a case study. It was like the worst country in these terms of the European Union and things like that. So what did we do? Actually, a huge debate. The extreme left won. Guess what? This was, by the extreme left. And there was this socialist party prime minister who did this on the 1st of January. He decriminalized all drugs, including cocaine and heroin. I could show you the graphs. But if you look at the graphs, then you'll see just that everything is blossoming, it's like flourishing from this moment on. The drug addicts, the number of drug addicts is just going downhill completely. The diseases transmitted through the use of needles and so on and so forth has decreased, but so much that it's, completely under control now, especially for a country with such a problems and so on and so forth. And basically, the only compulsory part is that we force the drug addicts to enter into some state-run programs with methadone and things like that, who are actually, I'm not looking at, I am. And I think that if you consult the data, there's a Cato paper from which I'm quoting this, from Glenn Greenwald. He completely explained and very well what happened and how good this was. And yes, Portugal could manage this problem, and now I think that we are an example. As Students for Liberty used to say, liberty works, let's give it a try. And I would add something, probably the last slide of all. Liberty works indeed, as you used to say, but it also favors virtue. And I think that's a great thing. Thank you.